When a woman comes back after she leaves you, it creates confusion more than clarity. Most men don't know how to handle it because the emotions are still fresh, the questions are still open, and the ego is still reacting to the past. One part of you wants to reconnect, another part wants answers, and another part wants to protect yourself from being hurt again. That mix is where most bad decisions happen. The truth is, return doesn't automatically mean things are fixed. People come back for different reasons. Sometimes it's loneliness, sometimes curiosity, sometimes regret, and sometimes genuine reflection. But none of that matters more than one thing: the pattern that caused the separation in the first place. If you treat her return emotionally, you lose control of the situation again. If you ignore it completely, you may miss a real opportunity for something better and more stable. The key is not reacting fast, but responding with awareness. This is where emotional control becomes more important than emotion itself. You need clarity before closeness. You need observation before access. And you need to understand what her return actually represents before deciding what role she plays in your life again. In this breakdown, you will learn exactly how to respond when a woman comes back after leaving you, what her return usually means, what to avoid, and how to position yourself so you don't fall back into the same cycle. 1. Don't react too fast. When a woman comes back after leaving you, the first mistake most men make is reacting immediately, replying too quickly, opening the door emotionally, or acting like nothing happened. But that fast reaction gives away your position before you even understand hers, because her return is not automatically a commitment. It is a signal that needs interpretation, not celebration, so the first move is to slow everything down internally. Not out of anger or games, but out of clarity. You need to see the situation as it is, not as you wish it to be, because the moment you respond emotionally, you shift back into the same pattern that already ended once before, and nothing has changed yet. She left a version of the connection that did not work, and now she is returning to a version of you she remembers, not necessarily a better one. So your first responsibility is to create space between her action and your response. That space is where control exists, and without it, you fall back into familiarity instead of building something new. Many men think quick replies show interest or confidence, but in this situation it shows dependence on the connection. It signals that her return immediately affects your emotional state. And that removes leverage. Instead, you observe timing, tone, and consistency in her approach. Is she direct or casual? Is she accountable or vague? Is she trying to reconnect properly or just re-enter your attention? Because these details matter more than the fact that she came back, and if you miss them, you accept her presence without understanding her intention, which puts you in the same vulnerable position again. Emotional control here does not mean ignoring her. It means not letting urgency lead your response. Because urgency is what created imbalance in the first place, and if nothing has changed in your reaction, nothing will change in the outcome. So you slow your response, you stay grounded, and you make sure your attention is not automatically available just because she returned. This is the first filter that protects you from repeating history, and it sets the tone that access to you is no longer automatic, it is measured. And that alone changes the entire dynamic before anything else is even said between you two. 2. Understand why she came back. Before you decide what to do with her return, you need to understand the reason behind it, because a woman can come back for multiple reasons that have nothing to do with rebuilding a stable relationship. And if you assume the reason instead of reading it, you will step into the same cycle again. One common reason is comfort withdrawal. She left, explored distance, and now realizes the emotional or practical comfort you provided is missing. So she returns not because the issue is solved, but because the absence feels noticeable. Another reason can be emotional comparison, where she has experienced other situations or people and now reflects back on what you offered, sometimes in a more favorable light, but that reflection is often selective. Focusing on feelings rather than the actual problems that caused the breakup. There is also curiosity-based return, where she simply wants to see if you are still the same, still available, still emotionally where she left you, and this type of Return is dangerous if you misread it as commitment, because curiosity is not investment, it is observation, and observation can end just as quickly as it starts. Another possibility is timing regret, where she reflects on her decision after emotional distance and starts questioning whether leaving was the right move. But even regret does not automatically equal readiness to fix things. It only means internal conflict. And conflict without action is not stability, so your job is not to assume which one it is, but to observe how she behaves after she returns, because intention reveals itself through consistency, not words. If she is serious, she will show stability, accountability, and effort to rebuild trust. But if she is uncertain, she will be inconsistent, vague, and emotionally selective, appearing and disappearing in ways that keep you engaged but not fully secure. And this is where many men lose clarity, because they focus on the emotional meaning of her return instead of the behavioral pattern that follows it. The return itself is not the answer, it is the beginning of another test. And if you treat it as closure or resolution, you ignore the real information being shown to you, so you stay grounded. You watch more than you react, and you make sure you understand the motivation behind her return before you give it emotional weight, because without that understanding, you are not reconnecting with a person who changed. You are re-entering a situation that may still carry the same problems as before, just with a different starting point, and that is how men repeat cycles without realizing it, by reacting to presence instead of analyzing intention. 3. Don't rebuild what broke the same way. When a woman comes back after leaving you, the biggest mistake is trying to rebuild the connection exactly how it was before, because that version already failed once, and repeating it only resets the same outcome. Many men fall into familiarity because it feels comfortable. You know the rhythm, the conversations, the emotional flow, and you naturally slip back into old patterns without questioning whether those patterns actually worked. But if the foundation caused separation before then, returning to it without change only delays the same ending, so instead of restarting the old dynamic, you need to observe what specifically led to the breakdown, whether it was inconsistency, lack of clarity, emotional distance, misaligned expectations, or lack of mutual effort, because rebuilding without addressing the cause is just repetition with a temporary reset, and emotionally it feels easier because there is history. But strategically, it is dangerous because history also contains failure patterns. This is where emotional discipline matters more than emotional comfort, because comfort will push you to act familiar, while discipline pushes you to act correctly, and those two are not the same. When she returns, she may also expect familiarity. She may try to slip back into the same emotional space without acknowledging what changed. But if you accept that automatically, you are allowing the same structure that collapsed before to restart unchanged, and that is where you lose leverage again. Instead, you create a new standard for interaction, not by being cold or distant, but by being aware that things cannot return to the same level without growth or clarity. You don't need to punish the past or bring up old issues in a dramatic way, but you do need to internally recognize that the previous version of the connection is no longer enough, and your behavior should reflect that awareness, meaning you are more measured, more observant, and more intentional with how you engage, because now you have experience with how it ended, and that experience changes your decisions. Another key point is not overcompensating just because she returned. Many men increase effort out of fear of losing her again. But that fear-driven behavior puts you right back into imbalance. Instead of rebuilding from strength, you rebuild from anxiety, and that is exactly what led to the breakdown in the first place. So the focus is not on recreating emotional intensity, but on establishing emotional clarity, where both people understand what went wrong and whether anything has actually changed. Without clarity, you are just revisiting a familiar cycle, and with clarity, you're deciding whether a new version is even possible. And that difference is what determines whether her return becomes a reset of the past or a completely new direction forward. 4. Watch her actions, not her words. When a woman comes back after leaving you, what she says will often sound better than what she actually does, and this is where most men get pulled back into the same emotional cycle, because words are easy to give when emotions are active. But actions require consistency over time, so you need to shift your attention away from explanations, apologies, or emotional language and focus completely on behavior patterns. Does she show up consistently, or does she appear in bursts? Does she take responsibility for what happened, or does she subtly rewrite the past? Does she make real effort to rebuild trust, or does she rely on familiarity to carry the connection forward? Because these answers are more important than anything she says in the moment. Many women will return with emotional softness. They may express regret, nostalgia, or affection, and all of that can feel convincing. But emotion without structure does not rebuild anything. It only creates temporary closeness, and that closeness can feel real while still being unstable, so your role is not to reject her words, but to verify them through time and consistency, because truth in behavior only reveals itself after repetition, not in isolated moments. Another key detail is how she reacts when you don't immediately respond the way she expects. If she becomes patient, steady, and understanding, that shows emotional maturity. But if she becomes inconsistent, withdrawn, or tries to regain control of your attention through emotional pressure, then nothing has changed. She is still operating from the same patterns that led to separation, and this is where emotional discipline protects you, because it prevents you from being influenced by short-term expressions that feel meaningful but are not supported by consistent action. You also need to observe whether she integrates back into your life naturally or whether she requires constant reassurance to stay engaged, because real rebuilding does not rely on emotional maintenance. It relies on stable behavior, and when stability is absent, the connection becomes dependent again, which is exactly what you are trying to avoid. This is also where many men confuse intensity with progress, thinking that more emotional conversation or deeper talks mean things are improving. But intensity can exist without stability, and when it does, it usually leads back to the same cycle. So instead of getting pulled into emotional highs, you stay focused on patterns. Over time, because patterns do not lie, and they reveal whether her return is grounded in real change or just temporary emotion. And once you start seeing behavior clearly, without filtering it through hope or fear, you gain control over the situation again. Because you are no longer reacting to what she says, you are responding to what she consistently does, and that is the only reliable way to decide whether anything meaningful can actually be rebuilt or whether you are simply being placed back into a familiar cycle with a different starting point. 5. Don't overinvest emotionally too early. When a woman comes back after leaving you, one of the fastest ways men lose control again is by overinvesting emotionally before she has proven anything through consistency. The return itself creates excitement. Memories come back, emotions resurface, and it becomes easy to act like things are already repaired, but that emotional acceleration puts you in the same vulnerable position you were in before, because you are giving access without verification, and access without verification is what creates imbalance. You need to understand that her return does not automatically reset trust. It only resets contact, and contact is not the same as commitment or stability. So if you start giving too much attention, too much availability, or too much emotional openness too quickly, you are building depth on unstable ground, and that always leads to the same outcome. Instead, you pace yourself internally. You stay engaged but not emotionally dependent. You respond, but you do not chase emotional closeness as a reward for her return, because if you do, you are already assuming the outcome you want without evidence. Another important point is that emotional overinvestment often makes men ignore red flags they would normally notice, because the desire to reconnect overrides logic, and that is exactly how patterns repeat. You start excusing inconsistency, minimizing past issues, and interpreting neutral behavior as progress simply because you want things to work. But desire does not fix structure, it only clouds judgment. So emotional restraint is not about being cold. It is about protecting your clarity while the situation is still developing. You allow her to show consistency over time before you match emotional depth. Not because you are playing games, but because real connection cannot be rushed without consequences. And when you slow yourself down emotionally, you also force the situation to reveal itself honestly. If she is serious, she will naturally adjust to that pace. and show stability without pressure. But if she is uncertain, she will struggle with the lack of immediate emotional reinforcement, and that difference tells you everything you need to know. Many men mistake emotional distance for losing the opportunity. But in reality, emotional pacing is what prevents you from losing yourself in a situation that has not proven itself yet, and the strongest position you can hold in this stage is calm engagement, where you are present, responsive, and aware. But not emotionally overcommit to a future that has not been built yet, because once emotional investment is too high too early, you lose the ability to evaluate her actions clearly. And you fall back into hope-driven thinking instead of reality-driven observation. And that is exactly what you are trying to avoid when someone returns after leaving, because the goal is not to relive the past connection. It is to see whether a new and stable one is actually possible based on behavior, not emotion alone. 6. Set a new standard quietly. When a woman comes back after leaving you, one of the most important shifts you must make is not spoken, it is demonstrated, because trying to verbally establish rules or conditions too early can create resistance or emotional pushback. But quietly changing your standard changes the entire dynamic without conflict. This means you do not behave the same way you did before. You do not overextend yourself emotionally. And you do not automatically give the same level of access she had previously. Instead, you operate from a more grounded position where your time, attention, and emotional energy are no longer freely available by default. This is not about punishment or making her prove herself through games. It is about alignment. Because the version of the connection that broke down before was built on a certain dynamic, and that dynamic needs to be different now if anything is going to last. So your behavior naturally reflects that awareness. You respond when it makes sense, you engage. When there is consistency, and you step back when things feel unclear, not as a reaction, but as a standard, and this shift is often felt more than it is discussed, because people adapt to energy faster than they adapt to words. She will notice that you are not as emotionally reactive as before, that you are not as quickly available, and that you are not filling gaps in the same way you used to, and this creates a new reference point for how interaction with you works, another key part of. Setting a new standard is not rushing into emotional familiarity, because familiarity is what often recreates old patterns. Instead, you allow the relationship to rebuild slowly if it is going to rebuild at all, without forcing emotional depth too early, and this patience communicates control. It shows that you are not trying to recreate the past out of fear or loneliness, but you are evaluating the present based on reality, not memory. And that alone changes how she approaches the connection. Because she is now dealing with a version of you that is not operating from emotional dependency, but from awareness, and that awareness sets a different tone for everything that follows. You also stop over-explaining yourself or over-justifying your boundaries, because when you have to explain your standard repeatedly, it loses strength. But when it is simply reflected in how you act, it becomes clear without resistance and over time. This quiet shift forces clarity into the situation either. She adjusts to the new standard through consistent behavior, or she reveals through inconsistency that the return was not grounded in real change, and that is the point of this stage. Not to control her behavior, but to expose whether alignment exists or not. Because without a new standard, you are not rebuilding anything, you are just restarting the same structure that already failed, and setting that standard quietly ensures that whatever happens next is based on present behavior, not past attachment or emotional history. 7. Be ready to walk away again. When a woman comes back after leaving you, the strongest position you can hold is not emotional attachment. It is readiness to walk away if nothing has actually changed, because without that internal willingness, you automatically place her return above your own standards, and that shifts the balance again in her favor. The moment you feel like you cannot lose her a second time, you start tolerating things you should not tolerate. You start accepting inconsistency, and you start lowering your expectations just to keep the connection alive, and that is exactly how the cycle repeats. So your mindset must be clear from the beginning. Her return is not a guarantee of anything. It is an opportunity to observe whether real change exists. And if it does not, you're prepared to step away without emotional collapse or confusion. This does not mean you are cold or disconnected. It means you are anchored in self-respect rather than emotional uncertainty, because the reality is, if the same, patterns that cause the separation appear again, then the outcome is already predictable, and staying in that loop only delays what you already know. Being ready to walk away also changes how you behave in the connection, because you are no longer operating from fear of loss. You are operating from clarity, and that clarity removes pressure from your decisions. You are not trying to force her to stay. You are not trying to secure her emotionally. You are simply evaluating whether her presence adds stability or confusion to your life, and this shift is powerful because it prevents emotional dependency from rebuilding itself silently. Another important aspect is that when a woman senses that you are not emotionally trapped in her return, her behavior often becomes more honest because there is no hidden leverage of attachment to exploit. She either shows up consistently or she does not, and both outcomes give you information, and information is what protects you from repeating mistakes. Many men lose this position because they assume that her return means progress has already happened. But progress is only real when behavior changes, not when access is restored. So you remain grounded. You do not rush emotional decisions. And you do not abandon your standards just to maintain connection. Because if you do, you are not rebuilding anything meaningful. You are just re-entering a cycle that already ended once. And that is why being ready to walk away is not about rejection. It is about protection. It ensures that your decisions are based on reality instead of attachment, and it keeps you from becoming emotionally invested in potential instead of truth. And when you operate from that position, you stay in control of your direction regardless of whether she stays or leaves again, because your stability is no longer dependent on her presence. It is dependent on your own standards and awareness. At the end of the day, when a woman comes back after leaving, the real test is not what she says, it is what you allow. Because the moment you forget your own standards just to keep her close, you are already back in the same position you are trying to avoid. You don't need to rush closure, you don't need to rush reconnection, and you don't need to prove anything through emotional effort. You simply stay steady and let time reveal whether her return carries consistency or just emotion. If she is serious, she will match stability with stability. If she is uncertain, she will reveal it through inconsistency again. And your job is not to chase clarity, it is to observe it. The strongest position you can hold is quiet awareness, where you are open to connection but not dependent on it, available but not overexposed, engaged but not emotionally unguarded. That balance keeps you from falling into old patterns because you are no longer reacting from hope or fear, you're responding from experience. And experience is what protects you from repeating cycles that already showed you their outcome. If she stays, it will be because she aligns with your standard, not because you lowered it. If she leaves again, it will not shake your direction because your stability is no longer built around her presence.